So step one, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Here we are in January again, looking at step one again. I've got step one. Why do we have to keep going back to it? Some might moan. Well, it's the cornerstone of our program. And the cornerstone is the first stone that's laid in the construction of any building that is built from stone or brick. In construction, it's imperative that this stone be laid correctly, or everything else in the building will be askew. And the same is true with our recovery. If we don't lay that first stone, the first step properly, everything will eventually crumble. Let me use this church as an example. Standing here for well over 100 years, built in 1905, and when they started the construction of this church, they laid a cornerstone of sandstone, probably in the northeast corner, but for the purpose of my illustration, let's say it was in the northwest corner. Let's pretend that that piece of sandstone was 12 inches long. And if they had started that piece of sandstone just a quarter of an inch out of plumb, by the time they reached the 100 feet length in this block, the southwest corner of this church would be somewhere in the middle of the sidewalk. By then, they would be out by 2.5 feet. Now, unlike a building that once it's built stands strong and erect if that cornerstone is laid properly, I'm not like that. My cornerstone was not laid properly in my family of origin. And as a result, my structure shifts around constantly, and I have to adjust to correct that so I don't head off in the wrong direction. That is why I reset my cornerstone each and every morning by reminding myself that I am powerless over my addictions and starting fresh through prayer and meditation with a connection to my higher power. So the combination of step one, cemented by God, is the cornerstone of my program each and every day. And if I do not do that each morning, I am already exhibiting relapse behavior. Now last week, Pete talked about the first part of step one, powerlessness. And I think that that's the hardest part of step one for most, if not all of us. I had to look at the unmanageability in my life in order to gather enough evidence that I could start to understand that I might be powerless. Another word for unmanageability might be harmful consequences. And as addicts and alcoholics, we tend to want the instant gratification of drinking, using, relationships, sex, pornography, gaming, gambling, the list goes on, without ever considering the unmanageability or the harmful consequences of not being able to wait long enough in sobriety to get the rewards. I'm going to show you a short video, which I think is a really good representation of the things that we go through when we're making those excruciating choices. You ready?
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
So it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did?
Yeah.
You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
It doesn't matter which kid we're talking about, they were all struggling with the concept of deferred gratification. They were all experiencing the harmful consequences and unmanageability. And part of working our program and working step one is reminding ourselves why we have chosen not to drink or to use or to act out. Sometimes we call that playing the tape to the end. The big book tells us that we are not to regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. And here's why. We all remember the major harmful consequences: hangovers, arguments, violence, DUIs, jail, lost jobs, no money, no friends, at least not any real friends, guilt, shame, remorse, divorce, homelessness, health issues. But there are many subtle harmful consequences that we have never considered or that we're unwilling to acknowledge. So how about adding up what your addiction has cost you financially? Now that's an exercise that we do in treatment just to get people to total up how much the substance has cost them, the loss of income has cost them, the increased insurance rates and that type of thing. But how about other things that are a little bit more subtle, like depression and anxiety? Not to say that they're subtle or not to downplay them, but they're not usually the ones we think about. How about our loss of connection to God or anything spiritual? How about paranoia, loss of self-esteem, inability to love yourself, loneliness, loss of sleep or too much sleep, accidents or injuries? How about events that we've missed, risky behaviors, loss of respect, unproductive at work or being demoted, ability to focus on anything? How about theft or being estranged from family and friends, failing grades at school, loss of relationships with our children? The list goes on and on. So I titled tonight's message, Dangerous Self-Deception, and the reason I did is this: because I believe that is what happens to us when we don't work our program, and it is also what leads to relapse. Sometimes we deceive ourselves when we're thinking about the unmanageability or the harmful consequences. We only want to think of the major ones, like in the shorter list that I read, and not the longer list of more subtle ones. One of the exercises that we hand out at Recovery Calgary is a harmful consequences list. But before we do that, we just have everybody kind of shout out what harmful consequences they've had. And it never seems to matter whether the group is just a few people or a larger group, we only ever manage to come up with 8 or 10 harmful consequences that we write on the whiteboard. And then we hand out our list on which there are 54 possible harmful consequences. And after that group, having only been able to come up with 8 or 10, circles the ones that are on the list. Almost without exception, everybody circles somewhere between 30 and 45 harmful consequences. Now that's dangerous self-deception. We think there's only 6 or 8 because we want to minimize the damage and the harmful consequences. Do you have the slide up there for me now, Doug? So this is a thought for the day that I sent out on January 9th. And it says, the most liberating day of my life was the day I freed myself from my own self-destructive nonsense. And that really struck me because I thought in terms of this message, how much of this stuff, how much of these harmful consequences, how much of the dangerous self-deception is self-destructive nonsense that I engage in. And that's why we have the title tonight. I think our crafty minds are capable of dangerous self-deception in so many areas of our life. So right now I'm going to do a little test, and it requires a little audience participation. So I want everybody who has a driver's license or who has had a driver's license to please stand up. Everybody who has a driver's license, who has ever had a driver's license, to please stand up. So it looks like 95% probably. Now I want everybody who is a less than average driver to sit down. And 3 or 4 people sat down, and I'd be willing to bet, because I've done this test before, that some of you that are remaining standing have either lost your driver's license at some point in your life or don't have one now because you've lost it. So this is an evidence of dangerous self-deception. So thanks very much, and I happen to ride around with Pete. He's not in the top 50%. One of the ways that we are at risk is the way we are guilty of dangerous self-deception by convincing ourselves that we are working a good program when we aren't. And one of the first signs of that are in some of the things that we say. And our scripture tonight ties in with that. Our scripture tonight is from Mark chapter 7, verses 20 to 23 in the New Living Translation. And this scripture comes after Jesus has had to explain to his disciples what he had just told the crowd outside. Jesus had just said to the crowd, "All of you listen and try to understand. It is not what goes into your body that defiles you. You are defiled by what comes from your heart." The word defiled means to make impure or unclean or to contaminate. Now, earlier in this chapter of Mark, the Pharisees were questioning Jesus as to why his disciples were not washing their hands before eating, according to the traditional methods. And Jesus was explaining that it is not what we put into our mouths that make us unclean. It is what is in our heart and what comes out of our mouths from our heart that makes us impure. Behind closed doors, he said to his disciples, "Don't you understand either? Can you not see that the food you put into your body cannot defile you? Food cannot go into your heart. It only passes through your stomach and into the sewer." And then he added, "It is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you." These are pretty big character defects that Jesus is talking about. Like the slide we just looked at, which said the most liberating day of my life was the day I freed myself from my own self-destructive nonsense, the stuff that comes from within. This is self-destructive nonsense. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lust, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. We need to guard against these things. They are all forms of unmanageability, and they will all lead to relapse. We come into the program analyzing our unmanageability and deciding we are powerless over alcohol, drugs, pornography, relationships, gambling, whatever it is for you. And that's how our program starts. And if we don't work our program, which includes step 1 every day, we're quickly on the road to relapse, not the road to recovery. We might find that we are deceitful. We start lying again, and we know that every lie we tell begins with a lie to ourselves. We might lie about how we are doing, or why we haven't been going to meetings, or why we haven't been calling our sponsors. We might lie by omission by not telling people that we've been having relapse thoughts. We may find ourselves having lustful thoughts, thinking of being with somebody other than our current partner. That's lust and can lead to adultery. We might be keeping secrets about our whereabouts and who we have been with. In other words, deceit and possibly adultery again. We may be hanging around with old drinking or using friends or people who are involved in criminal activities, and that's foolishness. We might be going to bars and parties, deceiving ourselves that we won't be the one who relapses because we're working a good program. Well, if you're doing that, you aren't working a good program, because being in high-risk situations is one of the leading causes of relapse. We might be contacting people on Facebook or by text who we shouldn't be contacting. That's deceit, like Jesus talks about. We might be seeing somebody romantically and lying to our sponsor or mentor or counselor about it because they suggested no relationships until you're healthy. We might even be lying to ourselves saying, oh, this person I'm hanging around, we're just friends. Is anybody in? You don't have to put your hand up. I know that I've done, oh, we're just buddies, right? We might be on Tinder or Grindr, Plenty of Fish, Ashley Madison, or any one of dozens of other sites that we shouldn't be on. Lust and possibly adultery. We might be keeping secrets, which we would definitely be doing if we were doing any of the above behaviors. And anything we do that we have to keep secret, we shouldn't be doing, and is relapse behavior. As Jesus said, it is what comes from within that defiles you. All of these things that I have mentioned are but a few of the signs of unmanageability creeping back into your life. This is what I mean by dangerous self-deceit. We can tell everybody that we're working a good program. We can be going to 3, 4, or 5 meetings a week, talking to our sponsor, helping others, praying and meditating. But if we're doing any of those things, any of them, we're not working our program because we're not practicing the principles in all our affairs. And just because you have 2 years or 5 years or 20 years of sobriety doesn't make you immune. I would venture a guess that the cornerstone that was supposed to be laid in our family of origin is a little out of square for most of us, and therefore our foundation is a little bit wonky. There are underlying issues which drive our behaviors: abuse, neglect, lack of self-worth, messages that have become ingrained that were put there by parents, teachers, priests, abusers, messages that keep us stuck and that just aren't true. but they keep us trapped unless we do the work. Unless we get help to figure out why we continually migrate back to our old ways without ever knowing why. They are the reasons we cross-addict, the reason we stop drinking or using and then getting into unhealthy relationship after unhealthy relationship. They are the reason we stop drinking or using and start overspending or overeating or gambling. I believe there is a big difference between abstinence and sobriety. The sobriety I talk about is emotional sobriety. Emotional sobriety requires digging deeper, changing the way you think, the way you react, the choices you make, the way you treat people, and most importantly, how you relate to yourself. People who get this part and do this work don't relapse. They recognize unmanageability when it starts to creep back in, and they do something about it. Now, I challenge you tonight to ask yourself, whether you have 24 hours or 40 years of clean time, is there unmanageability in my life? Am I resting on my laurels? Is there more that I can do? Am I actually working my program or only doing the visible things to keep up a good front and to keep people from asking if everything is okay? If, like me, your cornerstone was a little wonky to start, there's always more work to do. As Jesus suggests, check your heart, see what evil lurks within, and ask yourself, what is coming out of my mouth?